Hello there, and welcome to Depths of Unknown. Tonight we talk about ancient time period. 10,000 years ago, the ocean was different. Not different in the way that the ocean changes from season to season, or even from decade to decade. Different in ways that are fundamental, measurable, and in some cases irreversible. The sea level was lower, the water was colder in different ways and warmer in different ways. The chemistry was different, and the biology, the vast, complex, globally interconnected web of life that the ocean sustains, was profoundly different from what exists today. The difference between the ocean of 10,000 years ago and the ocean of today is the story of one of the greatest biological transformations in Earth's recent history. A transformation that spans the entire duration of human civilization, and that human civilization has both witnessed and caused. In 10,000 BC, the world was just emerging from the last ice age. The glaciers of the Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets were retreating, returning the water they had locked in ice to the ocean, and the sea level was rising, at its peak rate perhaps a meter per century, progressively submerging the coastal landscapes and shallow continental shelves that had been dry land during the glacial maximum. The ocean of 10,000 BC was approximately 60 meters lower than it is today at its beginning and rising. The continental shelves of the world, the North Sea, the English Channel, the Persian Gulf, the Bering Sea, the South China Sea, were large areas of coastal plain inhabited by terrestrial animals and eventually by human populations who fished the coasts of a sea that was not yet as wide as the sea, there was not yet as wide as the sea. Descendants would eventually sail. The forest of what is now the North Sea floor was inhabited by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, a culture known to archaeologists as Doggerland, who fished its rivers and hunted its wildlife on land. That the rising post-glacial ocean was consuming meter by meter over the centuries, eventually swallowing entirely by approximately 6,000 years ago. The submerged landscape of Doggerland is now the floor of the North Sea, and the tools and animal bones and human remains of its inhabitants are occasionally brought up in the nets of North Sea fishing vessels, artifacts of a world that the ocean took, along with the forests and rivers and coasts of 100 other submerged landscapes around the world. The ocean we think of as fixed geography was still in the process of becoming itself, and in the water that already existed, filling the deep basins of the Atlantic and Pacific and Indian and Southern Oceans. There was a biological community of extraordinary richness whose population sizes and geographic extents we have only recently begun to be able to estimate, and whose comparison with the ocean of today reveals a story of loss that the ocean itself cannot tell, but that the science of historical marine biology is slowly making legible. The ocean of 10,000 years ago was full. This is the single most important statement that can be made about it. And it requires explanation because the fullness of the ancient ocean is not intuitively apparent from the perspective of the modern ocean. Today's ocean is not obviously depleted to the naked eye. It is vast and blue and largely invisible in its interior, and the evidence of its biological impoverishment is largely invisible from the surface or from a beach. But the scientific discipline of shifting baselines, the recognition that each generation of human observers takes the ocean they first encounter as the natural baseline and fails to account for the depletion that occurred before their observation began, has produced a picture of the historical ocean that is genuinely astonishing in the scale of what has been lost. The term was coined by fisheries biologist Daniel Pauly in 1995 to describe the way in which the reference point for what is natural and abundant shifts downward with each generation of scientists and fishermen. A grandfather who fished Chesapeake Bay in 1900 had a completely different understanding of normal fish abundance than his grandson fishing the same bay in 2000. and both were measuring against the abundance of their own experience rather than against the historical baseline that the bay supported before any commercial fishing occurred. The work of Daniel Pauly and colleagues in documenting the global collapse of marine fish populations over the past century, combined with the historical ecology research of researchers like Lauren McClenachan, Ransom Myers, Boris Worm, and Jeremy Jackson, has reconstructed the ocean's biological past from old fishing records, logbooks, skeletal remains, sediment cores, and indigenous oral histories. The ocean of 10,000 years ago had whale populations that were, by the best estimates of historical reconstructors, approximately 10 to 15 times larger than current populations in many species. It had shark populations that were perhaps 100 times their current numbers, not 100 times more than today's already depleted populations, but 100 times the depleted population, which is a figure whose magnitude is difficult to hold in the mind. It had sea turtle populations in the Caribbean and Atlantic that, by the estimates of historians working with colonial-era accounts, were large enough to navigate ships. Sailors reported changing course based on the sound of sea turtles, and ships anchoring offshore reported the noise of turtles as persistent and loud enough to disturb sleep. The ocean of 10,000 BC was not the ocean that people who go to the beach today recognize. It was an ocean so biologically dense, so rich in large animals, that its closest modern equivalent in terms of megafauna density is perhaps a marine protected area that has been entirely closed to fishing for a century. And even that comparison understates the abundance of the ancient ocean. The specific animals that dominated the marine ecosystems of 10,000 BC and the millennia following it represent a roster that in many cases includes species that still exist but in numbers so reduced that their ecological function, their role in the ecosystem, has been fundamentally altered. The great whales of the North Atlantic, the blue whale, the fin whale, the right whale, the sperm whale, were present in numbers that current science estimates were between 10 and 30 times current populations. The right whale, now one of the most endangered large mammals on Earth with a population numbering fewer than 400 individuals in the North Atlantic, was once so abundant that European fishermen called the waters off Newfoundland and Labrador the right whale breeding grounds and hunted there for centuries before the population crashed. The whales of the ancient ocean were not simply more numerous, they were ecologically transformative in their abundance, their feeding behavior, their migrations, their nutrient cycling role, and their contribution to the biological productivity of the ocean surface through what oceanographers call the whale pump were all operating at scales that are impossible to replicate with current populations. When great whales feed at depth and surface to breathe and defecate at the surface, they bring nutrients from the deep ocean up to the photic zone where they fertilize phytoplankton growth. In the ancient ocean, with whale populations 10 to 30 times current levels, this whale pump was a significant driver of ocean productivity, a biological mechanism that has been substantially disabled by the removal of most of the world's whale population through commercial whaling. The sperm whale, whose deep diving behavior and distinctive click vocalizations make it one of the most studied cetaceans, maintained populations across all the world's deep ocean basins that constituted a significant fraction of the total biomass of the deep ocean. Sperm whales are deep divers whose carcasses, when they die and sink, create whale-fall ecosystems that sustain the deep seafloor for decades. With sperm whale populations at their historical levels, the frequency of whale falls in the deep ocean was sufficient to maintain a continuous network of these chemosynthetic ecosystems across the deep Atlantic and Pacific in a way that is no longer possible with current populations. The sharks of the ancient ocean, the great white, the oceanic whitetip, the hammerhead, the mako, were apex predators whose population sizes regulated the behavior and distribution of every species below them in the food web. When oceanic white-tip sharks were so numerous that they swarmed ships sunk in the Second World War and occupied large portions of the open Atlantic, They were not at their historical levels, they were already significantly depleted from their pre-industrial numbers. The oceanic whitetip alone has declined by approximately 98% from its estimated pre-industrial population. In the ocean of 10,000 BC, the oceanic whitetip was among the most abundant large shark species on Earth. The condition of the ocean's coastal zones in 10,000 BC presents an even more dramatic contrast with the present than the open ocean comparison. The coastal oceans, the estuaries, bays, coral reefs, kelp forests, and shallow water ecosystems that border the continents were at their historical peak of biological richness in the period between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, before the intensification of human coastal settlement and the beginning of systematic exploitation of coastal marine resources. The oyster reefs of Chesapeake Bay, whose beds once extended across the entire bay floor in formations meters thick, are the most documented example of coastal ecosystem transformation in historical ecology. The oysters that once filtered the entire volume of the Chesapeake Bay in a matter of days are now reduced to approximately 1% of their historical biomass, and the clarity and biological productivity of the bay that followed from that filtration capacity is gone with them. Before European settlement of the North American coast, a sailor entering Chesapeake Bay would have been navigating through waters so clear from oyster filtration that the bottom was visible in many places, a bottom covered in the complex, three-dimensional structure of living oyster reef that provided habitat for striped bass, blue crabs, and dozens of other species that depended on the reef structure for shelter and feeding. The historical accounts of European explorers encountering the bay describe a biological abundance that modern ecologists, working backward from the current state of the ecosystem, have worked to quantify, and the numbers are staggering. The Chesapeake oyster reefs at their historical extent were not a local phenomenon. They were representative of the coastal shellfish ecosystems that lined the estuaries and bays of the entire Atlantic coast. Massive, continuously inhabited structures of living and dead shell that stabilized sediment, filtered water, provided habitat for hundreds of species, and constituted a biological infrastructure that has been almost entirely dismantled in the past 3 centuries of harvesting. The sea grass beds of the world's shallow coastal waters, vast underwater meadows of marine flowering plants that provide nursery habitat for fish, sequester carbon, and support the dugongs and manatees and sea turtles and horses of the ocean shallows, extended across coastal areas that are now largely bare sand or degraded by nutrient pollution. The green sea turtle, which grazes seagrass, was present in Caribbean coastal waters in populations that historical ecologists estimate at approximately 60 to 90 million individuals, a figure that staggers the contemporary mind, which is accustomed to a species represented by perhaps a few 100,000 individuals globally and declared vulnerable to extinction. The coral reefs of the ancient ocean represent perhaps the most complex and the most consequential comparison between the ocean of 10,000 BC and the ocean of today. 10,000 years ago, as the sea level rose at the end of the last ice age, the coral reefs of the tropical oceans were recolonizing the submerging continental shelves, establishing new reef systems on the shallow limestone platforms that the rising water was progressively covering. The reefs of the Caribbean, the Indo-Pacific, the Red Sea, and the Australian coast were not simply more abundant 10,000 years ago. They were structurally different, dominated by different species and different growth forms than the reefs of today. The Caribbean reefs of 5,000 years ago were dominated by branching elkhorn and staghorn coral, Acropora palmata and Acropora cervicornis, species whose rapid growth and complex Acropora, three-dimensional structure built the high-relief reef frameworks that supported the extraordinary fish and invertebrate diversity of the historical Caribbean. The structural complexity of these ancient Caribbean reefs, the caves and overhangs and complex branching habitats created by dense Acropora cover, sustained fish communities whose biomass per unit area was By the estimates of historicologists working from early colonial records, 5 to 10 times the fish biomass found on the same reefs today. The grouper and snapper and jack populations that were the apex predators of these structurally rich reefs created what ecologists call a top-down cascade. Their predation controlled the populations of grazing fish and invertebrates, which in turn controlled the algae that compete with coral for reef space, maintaining the conditions under which coral could continue to grow and the reef structure could be maintained. These acropora corals have declined by approximately 95% from their historical cover across the Caribbean over the past few decades alone, a decline driven by warming waters, ocean acidification, disease, and nutrient pollution, and the reefs they built have largely collapsed into rubble fields and algae-covered limestone pavement. The loss of the Caribbean acropora reefs is the largest documented single-species loss of ecological function in any marine ecosystem in the observational record, and it has occurred within the lifetime of living scientists. The great fish populations that inhabited these structurally complex reefs, the groupers, snappers, and jacks that were the apex predators of the Caribbean reef ecosystem, were at their historical maximum in the period before European contact with the Americas and were systematically reduced by intensive fishing over the following 5 centuries to levels at which their ecological function as predators has been substantially compromised. The discoveries from the modern ocean, the things that scientists have found in the ocean since the beginning of systematic deep-sea exploration in the 1870s through to the present day, represent a completely different kind of ocean story from the story of biological abundance and loss. The Challenger expedition of 1872 to 1876, the first systematic scientific exploration of the deep ocean, discovered that the abyssal floor was not the bare, featureless, lifeless plain that scientists had assumed, but was inhabited by a diversity of life: sea cucumbers, brittle stars, polychaete worms, and microbial communities, adapted to conditions of extreme pressure, cold, and darkness that no previous scientific framework had considered compatible with life. The dredges and trawls of HMS Challenger brought to the surface organisms that had never been seen before, some of them representing new genera and families of animals that the existing classification system had no categories to accommodate. The work of the Challenger scientists, who filled 77 volumes of reports with their findings, established that the deep ocean was not an abiotic void but a habitat, and began the century and a half of systematic deep-sea exploration that has since produced one of the richest bodies of biological discovery in the history of science. The discovery of hydrothermal vents in 1977, communities of organisms sustained entirely by chemical energy from the Earth's interior rather than by sunlight, was the foundational discovery of the modern era of deep-sea biology and the beginning of the complete revision of the concept of habitability that now drives astrobiology. The first photographs from the deep-sea submersible Alvin at the Galapagos Rift showed a landscape that scientists described as nothing they had been prepared for: dense communities of giant tube worms reaching 2 meters in height, mats of white bacteria, clusters of large clams and mussels, all existing in complete darkness 2.5 kilometers below the surface, sustained by the chemical energy in superheated vent fluid. The biologists aboard were reduced to counting organisms in their notebooks, using the systems taxonomists use for plants, because the standard marine biology field guides for the area contained no entries for any of what they were seeing. Since the vent discovery, every decade of deep-sea exploration has added organisms and ecosystems that were entirely unknown. Cold seep communities where methane and hydrogen sulfide sustain biological communities in the total absence of photosynthetic energy. Whale-full ecosystems where the carcasses of dead whales sustain communities of specialized organisms for decades on the deep sea floor. The deep-sea coral reefs of the cold North Atlantic, discovered in their full extent only in the 1990s, whose carbonate structures, built in darkness at hundreds of meters depth, parallel the ecological function of tropical reefs, but in conditions of near-zero temperature and no sunlight. The discovery of the deep-sea biosphere. The community of bacteria and archaea living within the rocks and sediments of the ocean floor, in some cases meters below the seafloor surface, in conditions of extreme pressure and nutrient limitation, represents perhaps the most fundamental expansion of the known distribution of life on Earth since the discovery of the hydrothermal vents, and its implications for the total biomass of life on Earth and for the possibility of life in similarly extreme environments beyond Earth are still being assessed. What the comparison between the ocean of 10,000 BC and the ocean of today ultimately reveals is that the ocean is not a static system whose biological content can be taken as given, but a dynamic and historically variable system whose current state represents one point in a trajectory that has been shaped by both natural processes and human choices. The ocean of the ancient world was biologically richer in ways that had consequences for every physical and chemical process the ocean performs. Its ability to absorb carbon, its ability to cycle nutrients, its ability to regulate regional climate, its ability to sustain the fisheries that provide protein for hundreds of millions of human beings, the whale pump that brought deep nutrients to the sunlit surface, the oyster reefs that filtered coastal bays to crystal clarity, the vast seagrass meadows grazed by millions of sea turtles, the dense shark populations that structured the behavior of every species below them, the acropora reefs that built the three-dimensional complexity that Caribbean fish diversity required. All of these are ecosystem services, functions performed by biological communities that the ocean cannot perform as well, or at all, in their absence. And the ocean performs them today at a fraction of the capacity it had 10,000 years ago. The ocean of today is not simply a less abundant version of the ocean of 10,000 years ago. It is a structurally different ocean in which the roles played by apex predators, by large-bodied filter feeders, by reef-building corals, and by seagrass communities have been fundamentally altered by the removal of these organisms from the system. And simultaneously, the modern era of ocean science has revealed in the depths of the same ocean, in the vent communities and the cold seeps and the deep sediment biosphere, forms of life whose existence was entirely unsuspected 10,000 years ago, and that are as extraordinary in their own way as the megafauna that once dominated the surface. The ancient ocean had abundance at the surface that we have dismantled. The modern ocean has revealed complexity at depth that we had no idea existed. We have spent 10,000 years both discovering what the ocean contains and removing what it once had. And the question of what it will contain in another 10,000 years is one that the current generation of ocean scientists is uniquely positioned and uniquely responsible to help determine. The ocean contains multitudes that human civilization has spent 10,000 years both discovering and destroying. And the ocean's answer to what it will be next depends on whether what has been learned about it in the era of its greatest discovery can be applied in time to preserve what the era of its greatest loss has left behind.